In 1648, the 80-year war between Catholic Spain and the rebellious Dutch Protestant provinces ended with the Treaty of Westphalia's recognition of an independent Dutch republic. The Netherlands, notice that this country goes by a lot of names, emerged as a vital new political, economic, and cultural force. The Calvinist Protestants had no objection to lending money at interest, and Amsterdam replaced Florence as Europe's banking center. The Dutch East India Company dominated trade in the Indies and controlled much of the worldwide shipping that was bringing new prosperity to Europe. Religious toleration attracted immigrants, including America's future pilgrims, and they further contributed to Dutch wealth. So on this map, you see that the striped areas are the Dutch Republic. The paler areas, which are harder to see, are Flanders, or that portion of the Low Countries that was still Catholic and still controlled by Spain. That's where Rubens hung out. At a time when most Europeans worked in agriculture, over half the population of the Dutch Republic lived in towns of more than 30,000. So this urban middle class had an insatiable appetite for painting. Art historians estimate that between 5 and 10 million Dutch works of art were produced in the 17th century. Fewer of these, perhaps less than 1%, have survived, so few of us survived. This is a detail from a Dutch painting that shows a painter selling his paintings on the street. Amsterdam was not only Europe's financial center, it was also the center of Europe's art market. So the great works of the Italian and Flemish Baroque artists frequently passed through Amsterdam, and the Dutch painters took notice. So before we move on to look at specific Dutch works, I want you to watch just this very short video clip about the Dutch art market and its new kind of customer. Well, sure, he was a Catholic, and sure, he was a little crazy, but the tolerant and art-obsessed Dutch embraced Caravaggio all the same, especially his contrasts of light and dark and his portrayal of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events. So here's a Caravaggio wannabe Dutch version of The Calling of Matthew. Note that there's less chiaroscuro, that the composition is more crowded, and that there's more of a focus on counting money, which was a Dutch obsession. We see more chiaroscuro in this genre painting, and again, the influence of Caravaggio should be obvious. Now, note that the subject matter here is not biblical, but it is moralistic. On the right, we see a man succumbing to gluttony. Above him in a spotlight, we see a young prostitute with her aged procuress. Seated next to them is a man holding that well-known symbol of sexual impropriety, the lute. See, you do learn important things in art history. But what this rising Dutch middle class really gobbled up was portraits of themselves. The golden age of Dutch painting was also the golden age of portraiture, and one of its masters was Franz Halls. I'm a little surprised that The Laughing Cavalier doesn't appear in your textbook, since it's probably Hall's most famous painting. Franz Halls is especially admired for his ability to capture human expression, and you'll note that his vision of human nature is a great deal more cheerful and optimistic than Caravaggio's. Halls is also noted for his light, loose brushwork, which helped give his paintings a sense of spontaneity. Here's another of his famous works, another favorite, not in your book. By the way, even though he doesn't have very many paintings in your textbook, he does show up a lot on the AP test, so you need to know this artist. Here are the portraits that do show up, really less fun. The last couple of portraits gave Halls a chance to show off his exquisite rendering of textiles and of personality. But those Dutch Calvinists presented a challenge to portraitists. They dressed mostly in pretty, undifferentiated, and unrelieved black, except for those stark white collars, and they were also tricky to paint. The Dutch demand for group portraits also posed a compositional challenge for artists. How do you cram all these people into a painting and still make the painting interesting? Halls accomplishes this above all by giving each face an individual personality, really what's called psychological portraiture. But he also inserts intriguing diagonals. Look at those spears into the portrait of the archers of St. Hadrian. And he includes a kind of murky, mysterious landscape in his group portrait of the women regents. But then along comes Rembrandt, and the group portrait will never be the same. So notice we still have the dark, undifferentiated clothing, and the artist still faces the challenge of cramming a lot of people into a painting. Still, this work represents something of a breakthrough. The light is more dramatic. Note the tenebrism. Rembrandt, along with Caravaggio, was the great tenebrist in art history. The faces are even more differentiated and show even more psychological insight. He's a deeper painter than Halls. Light is used more dramatically, again, homage to Caravaggio, and note that this was painted when Rembrandt was just 26. He gets better. So we'll fast forward a decade and Rembrandt produces this masterpiece. It is one of the most famous paintings in art history, and yes, it shows up all over the AP test. I'm going to turn to one of my videos to explore this painting and Rembrandt's career. I've mentioned that the Dutch Calvinists refused to put art into churches, but this does not mean they opposed paintings of biblical scenes. Remember, they were ardent students of the Bible. They were also willing to hang such scenes in their homes or other public places that weren't churches. So Rembrandt's Old and New Testament scenes are actually among his most famous and his most moving works. Notice that in his later paintings, Rembrandt's style becomes rougher. He employs looser brushstrokes and has a somewhat more abstract depiction of his subjects. His colors, interestingly, become brighter, and his brushstrokes, as I said, are more pronounced. Interestingly, he's moving in the opposite direction from many of his Dutch contemporaries of the time. As we're going to see in a few minutes, Dutch painting over the 17th century actually became increasingly detailed, with small, fine brushstrokes, sharper lines, and really an effort by artists to show off how extraordinarily realistically they could depict what was before them. Remember, this is before the camera. In fact, contemporaries of Rembrandt often accused his later paintings of being coarse. I think we appreciate them partly because we look forward to the Impressionists and beyond them to more modern, more abstract painting. So what seemed to his contemporaries like he was, getting old and less competent to us looks like an artistic development. I think that is, in fact, the correct assessment. So we don't actually know much about Rembrandt's religion. He doesn't appear on any official church rolls. We do know that his father was a Dutch Calvinist, his mother was a Roman Catholic, and there's at least some evidence that he supported religious toleration. In this portrait, he portrays himself as the Apostle Paul with the letter to the Corinthians, a letter that devotes considerable space to deploring disputes among Christians. So Rembrandt painted more than 90 self-portraits. Like Albrecht Dürer from Germany in the Northern Renaissance Reformation, he seemed to enjoy tracking his own face throughout his lifetime. And notice he's not particularly kind to himself, not a handsome mug. Both of these portraits display the softer, loose brushwork style, but the later portrait is even more abstract. Note that while Rembrandt is a master of chiaroscuro, like Velasquez, he shows more gradations of light. Rembrandt was also a master of the art of etching. Etchings are made by covering a plate of metal with wax and then incising the drawing into the wax rather than into the metal plate. And then you pour acid in that etches through the metal plate where it was etched, or where it was drawn. Soft wax is easier to carve, and that allows for more diversity of shading and depth, as you see in this picture of Christ receiving the children. By the way, this is the kind of religious art that pious Calvinists would hang in their homes, though not in their churches, and Rembrandt sold huge numbers of these prints. The Dutch tolerance extended to women artists. There were several. Judithmeister, for example, had a successful career as a portraitist. Look at the portrait that she is showing herself painting. What artist does that remind you of? I think it looks a lot like a Franz Halls, and her style is similar to Halls, and they're often compared. Notice, by the way, the loose brushwork that she employs on the dress. It was particularly good for showing shimmer and shine in textiles. This painting does not appear in your textbook. It did appear on an AP test with the artist identified. It wasn't a work you were expected to know, but it's actually quite a cool work. This is a genre painting. We don't know who this woman was, and it's another moralistic work. Why do I say that? I'm going to let your classmate answer. You'll also see a resemblance to Vermeer, the painter with whom I'm going to end this lecture. Moralistic genre paintings take a more humorous, even satiric tone with the paintings of Jan Steen. I especially like the little boy who's weeping because he only got a birch switch from St. Nicholas. Steen's paintings are lively, even raucous, and he liked to use children to make points about adult behavior. This painting isn't in your textbook, but I like it. And what point do you think the artist is trying to make? I don't really know, but maybe these children are engaged in a fruitless endeavor. Cats have many talents, but dancing is not among them. Love the dog. Even though Dutch culture was predominantly urban, the long struggle to reclaim their land from the sea gave the Dutch great attachment to their countryside. No loose brushstrokes here. What you see is exquisite attention to detail, and especially the play of light through the clouds, a real common Dutch theme, and also on the land. Note how the people and the buildings in the countryside are all harmoniously integrated in this painting. This, too, is part of the Dutch vision, Dutch values, a peaceful, tamed countryside, people living in harmony with the land that they have brought under control. Here are a couple more examples of Dutch landscape painting. I'm not even going to bother to identify painters. I just want to give you a feel for what 17th century Dutch landscape painting looks like. Notice again the clouds. Winter scenes were popular with the Dutch. Think of Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow or Census in Bethlehem. Another typically Dutch Baroque genre was still life painting. These were very popular with the urban middle class customer, and they also gave painters a real opportunity to show off their ability to paint reflected light, transparent objects, and rich textiles. This painting also shows off the wealth and the widespread trading connections of the urban merchant class that's buying most of this art. Even back then, Ming vases from China were mighty pricey. Flower paintings were another very specific, very popular genre that showed off an artist's technical skill. Notice that the brushwork here is tight and precise. It's really almost invisible. Notice, too, the careful composition of this work, which has a strong diagonal. This painting may be still, but it's nevertheless dynamic. And by the way, note, this is another female artist. The College Board loves them. This is a so-called vanitas still life that combines the customer's taste for luxury goods, the artist's mastery of realism, and a moral message. And the moral message is life is vanity, life is fleeting. This is similar to the memento mori that we would often see in medieval and Renaissance paintings. So you see the timepiece, the turned over glass, the skull, all of these indicate that death is coming, that this life doesn't last. Notice the artist's self-portrait in the ball. This is really masterful painting. He's showing off. They like to do that. Fair enough. They were good at it. So I'm going to end with one of Holland's most beloved painters, and recently one of art history's more controversial painters. The controversy stems from speculation that he produced these exquisite details by cheating, kind of, using a camera obscura to copy his images. There's a documentary about to come out. It's entitled Tim's Vermeer that explores this issue. A friend of mine just saw it. Her brother's a producer, and she got an early copy. She says it's great. Might be another fun post-exam activity. Vermeer is a master of the play of light and shadows in domestic Dutch interiors. Whether he cheated or not, his mastery of details, especially surfaces, is extraordinary. And so are his expressions and the moods he catches, particularly women. And he painted largely women. We know this is a love letter because of the lute. In fact, remember, it probably suggests it was illicit love. By the way, the cast-off shoes in the front also apparently indicate that, a cast-off woman. We also see paintings behind her of a ship sailing away and a man walking down a path. These are images of abandonment. I just stuck this in because I love this painting. Note the loose brush strokes, the chiaroscuro, and above all, that highly evocative psychological portraiture. What is she thinking about? So we've already seen one Baroque painting about painting. And which work am I referring to? Las Meninas by Velasquez. You'll have to correct my pronunciation, Ms. Jacobs. Now Vermeer takes up the subject. I'm going to close this lecture and this unit, hooray, with a video segment about this wonderful painting. But before you watch it, I want to issue a little warning. This is going to be a tough test, and I'm not going to give out as many answers in the test review that I'll put up this weekend. You are going to need to spend some time preparing your presentations for one another and listen carefully to each other. And you're going to need to take some time to study the works. I am going to let you know which works will appear on the AP exam. So in that sense, you won't have a surprise, but you're going to have to do some research on your own. This is an extraordinarily rich and varied art historical period, and it's one you just need to know. Remember, by spring break, we'll be done with the study guide slog, into our test review. The end is in sight. Hang in there. So on to our video. Watch as much as you can.